We'll see. Thank you all for coming out. I know this is far from ideal weather, and I'm just really glad to see people come out and be interested in this story. It's especially important to me now because there's a really profound struggle going on in history and journalism and in the way that we preserve our memories. And I want to make sure that I've done my part of it. And even though we don't live here anymore, I consider this still my hometown. And the stories that happened here before and while I lived here are really important to me. So my latest book is about Michael Hardwick. And I wanted to talk to you tonight in terms of what it actually takes to bring a story like this to life. I never knew Michael. He died when I was just graduating from college. I didn't move here until 1997. I really didn't even know people who knew him until I started researching the book. But I knew as soon as I understood that the community still had living memory of him, that it was a story that I wanted to tell. So the problem with a story like this is, how do you get attached to it? How do you know how to approach it when it didn't happen in your lifetime? Memoir is something that some people write very well and very easily because they can lean on their own memory to construct a timeline and to figure out where to look for details to back those memories up. I didn't have any of that. But I did have some advantage from my previous book in that I already knew what was going on in Atlanta in the early 80s. And I knew about this case in the back of my mind. Oh, Bowers versus Hardwick. It's about sodomy law. It's about the right to privacy extending to queer people the same way it did to cis people. So when I started to investigate it, I realized I was going to really have to mine some details to be able to tell the story effectively. And I'm not sure how many are familiar with what we actually do as historians or journalists or a little bit of both. So I thought that's what I would talk about tonight, to reacquaint people who I think we all see doubt in the truth and very verifiable facts trying to obliterate memories from us. So I wanted to go back to one of my earliest memories, which is this book. One of my favorites, What Do People Do All Day? Richard Scarry. I used to read this every day when I was 3 or 4 years old because you'd open up a picture and there are hundreds of people, cartoon characters drawn in, and each one of them doing a different thing. And when my husband and I sit on our patio in Florida, I can look at other buildings and I don't know if it's like spying on neighbors or, the binoculars may be a bit too far. I can see what they're doing and everybody's got their own lives to conduct. As a historian, you're trying to figure out the lives that tell us a greater story. All of ours do. There are some that really rise above because of the circumstances that they find themselves placed into. Historians, our job is to create knowledge. Now that the facts exist, the people exist, a place exists, we're the ones who are responsible for knitting all that together into some legible way so that it's easily understood by people who don't spend their days digging in archives or getting a mold allergy to old books or losing their eyesight to looking at census records for hundreds of years. We look at evidence, things like interviews, even data now, census data, photos, video, and we try and determine the truth that comes out of reliable and verifiable information. So I'm also a part journalist. That's my work training. As a journalist, I usually focus on the who, what, where, the basics of the story that captures that, what we call the first draft of history. As a historian, I learn more about the how and the why. But as I've gotten older and as my careers have sort of merged together, I realized that there's a lot of overlap between those disciplines. And when I think of journalism, I think of immediacy. When I think of history, I think of something that's usually a little more formal and a little more rigidly composed. And that's not how I want to do it. So I consider myself part reporter, part historian, and I try to take the best of those disciplines when I do a book like this. So what I do all day long is I am somewhere in one of those basement rooms, temperature controlled, dark, cold, always cold. Archives are like 55 degrees, bring a sweater. What I came up with in this instance was this story is that was written into American history, and then we sort of forgot it. As queer people, we thought our rights were solidified and locked into place in 2015 when Obergefell versus Hodges was decided, when that acknowledged our right to have marriage in the same sense that straight people do. Like I said, I had this advantage that I was writing about Atlanta from the 70s and early 80s in my first book, A Night at the Sweet Gumhead. This one sort of picks up where that does. It sort of picks up around the corner even. I don't know how many of you have lived in Atlanta for a while. Sweet Gumhead was on Cheshire Bridge Road. Go down Cheshire Bridge, hang a left on Monroe Drive, there's the Cove. At one point, they were owned by the same person, and the crowds would sort of cross-pollinate. So I realized that the details of this story were going to overlap considerably with what I had already researched, but I would have to go out and find some new stuff too. So one of the things I did, it's not for everybody, but I went back to school twice. I went to UGA for MFA in narrative nonfiction, and then I went to Georgia State for a PhD in constitutional history, because this case would require me to be an expert in the last 50 years of the law of privacy if I wanted to have any kind of standing with the kind of people I wanted to interview. And I had a curiosity anyway, but this was the perfect excuse. COVID sort of descended on us all, made everybody be indoors people for a while anyway. That's when I started. And I really learned a lot about how much power we invest in the Supreme Court and how much that might feel misguided right now. But I'll talk a little bit more about the end. In a way, it's really interesting to be doing this here in this room, because in that courthouse, in 2013, my husband and I got our marriage license. We couldn't have a wedding here in Georgia because it wasn't yet legal, but the courthouse was more than happy to fill out the license paperwork and to FedEx it to Maryland, where we were married after Christmas in 2013. They would also give us a gun license from the same office. I don't know if they were suggesting something or if we really should have taken them up on it, but those two are in the same offices down there, in case you're interested. I feel like right now that right for me to have my marriage is in danger, so that propelled me through the research of this book, and it made me ask a lot of very basic questions. How did we get here? How did I go from pulling off on the side of the road once I heard about the Obergefell decision and applauding it and getting very emotional about it, to feeling very nervous about what the future holds? It required, just to get to the point of Obergefell, it required some people to put in some, thousands of hours of effort, lots of frustration went into it, and some people had to become very visible pieces of the movement to no personal gain whatsoever. In fact, a lot of debt that we owe to them. And that person that I speak of is Michael Hardwick. So Michael was a Florida native. He was born and raised in Miami, spent some time in Tennessee, spent some time in Gainesville, came to Atlanta for a visit in the mid-70s and met somebody and fell in love, went home, came out to his family, planned to move back up in with his new boyfriend, and then found out his new boyfriend had a boyfriend already. So went back to South Florida for a while, went back to Tennessee and had started a relationship with a man who had been adopted by his partner because they had no legal rights otherwise. It was a very complicated romantic situation. And it broke apart. So he came back to Atlanta. And one of the stories I was unable to confirm is that a couple of women who were his good friends here in Decatur encouraged him to come back to Atlanta in 1980 and just chill out, find a new job, reboot, start your life over again. So he did. On July 5th, 1982, he was walking out of the Cove. The Piedmont Park exists there now, but where the building was, there's a little road, Worcester Drive, and walk out onto Monroe Drive. He was leaving the bar and dropped a beer bottle into a trash can, and a police car pulled by down Monroe Drive, turned around at Orm Drive, and headed back toward him. Wrote him a ticket for public drinking. The officer, Keith Torek, and he disputed for the rest of Michael's life what had actually happened. Michael said he threw the bottle into the trash can, Torek said that he saw him drinking. Michael had been trained as a bartender and a bar manager, knew the laws, and I can't tell you exactly how many steps he took out of the bar to throw it in the trash can, but the police officer refused to go back and look in the trash can to confirm his story. Wrote him a ticket. Michael said, fine, just let me pay this ticket and get on with my day. It'll be a $50 fine. On the top of the ticket, there was a notation that says WEDTHUR, like Wednesday, Thursday, but there was a court date also on the ticket of July 13th. Michael looked at the top corner of it, and I think it was some filing system that the Fulton County court had put together that they knew they needed to address those citations on those days, but the actual court date was Tuesday. So Tuesday came and went, Michael didn't appear. The officer went right away to file a warrant and put it into the visor of his squad car and carried it with him. Michael realized that he hadn't paid the ticket and went to court, paid the fine that a judge let him pay, and thought the matter was solved. He had a note, he had a receipt from the court, everything's taken care of. But the officer didn't know that that had happened. So on August 3rd, he came to Michael's house on Ponce de Leon Place, 811 Ponce de Leon Place, and walked up the front steps, somehow gained access to the house. He disputes with a person in the house if he barged in or if he was allowed in. I spoke with the person on the couch, and he said he woke up out of a drunken haze to see a policeman standing over him. Knowing that there was pot drying in the kitchen, the guy who was sleeping on the couch pointed to the officer, said, if you're looking for him, he's probably down in his bedroom. Then scurried off to the kitchen to try and get rid of the pot while he was distracted. But when the police officer opened the door, Michael was having oral sex with a guy that he had met at the bar. And the police officer arrested them both for sodomy and for possession of marijuana. So in Georgia at the time, sodomy law, which meant the sex organs of one person in contact with the mouth or the anus of another person, no matter what their sex was, would be considered sodomy, and the potential prison sentence was up to 20 years. Where Michael was from in Florida, it was a misdemeanor. Most states, the penalty was a ticket, sometimes up to a year in jail, but Georgia was the outlier. Of all the places to be caught for something like sodomy, this was absolutely the worst place to be caught. So there was a court hearing. He pled not guilty. The ACLU made contact with him because they realized this is our chance to break this law and have it off the books and to set a national precedent. If this law was dismantled for this case, then it would hold precedent over the remaining states' sodomy laws. Something like 24 states at the time still had them. Michael had a meeting with 10 lawyers and his mother where they appealed to him, please, this is a perfect set of circumstances. We will never have a better set of facts behind us to take this to court. And his mother didn't want him to do it. She said, I may never see you outside of court, outside prison alive again. But after hearing the appeals of all the attorneys involved and a lot of friends too, he decided to do it. He thought, I have a good job that is in a gay-run business that will support me. The owner of the Cove offered to pay all his legal bills. He had a family who knew he was gay and loved him and supported him, and he could always go back to. He had an advantage that somebody who might have been a lawyer or an accountant or a sole proprietor of a business, they couldn't implode their career to be the face of a lawsuit like this. So he said, yeah, I'll do it. I don't think this is right. So on February the 14th, after Fulton County had declined to pursue this case, they knew it was a loser. It wasn't something that the county wanted to prosecute anyway because of the number of queer people living in the city of Atlanta. At the time, it was already over 250,000 people. And the head of the chief of police, the district attorney thought this should be a misdemeanor anyway. I'm not going to spend police and court time prosecuting this. So the ACLU realized without a conviction, we can't take this any further. So they compelled one by filing a lawsuit in district court on February the 14th, 1983. And the trajectory is clear. We were headed to the Supreme Court. It became an ACLU test case. as it was argued and decided in the Supreme Court, it would become a clear flouting of precedent. All the rules that applied to straight people would be overturned and disregarded in this case. And it became this massive amount of fuel for organizing the gay rights movement in its next wave, in the third wave, which accompanied the HIV/AIDS epidemic. It's a lot to find. There's a lot of moving pieces in this story, a lot of historical threads and precedents. So I had to look everywhere. The top left, you'll see the last long story that Michael gave to a magazine. That's from January of 1990. The top middle are Randy Schultz's notes from, and the band played on, in an archive in San Francisco that had some archival material from Michael appearing in San Francisco and different depositions during the case. On the right-hand side, one of the protests that happened after the decision, Sandra Day O'Connor had come to San Francisco and turned out 30,000 people to march in the streets against the decision. On the lower left, you'll see Michael's mugshot, which I personally tramped all over Atlanta looking for the originals. It does not exist in the jail records, in Atlanta police records, in Fulton County records, in municipal court records. It exists on a piece of videotape that sits in an archive in Nashville, Vanderbilt Television News Archive, which is a fantastic resource. And they also sort of looked the other way when I asked them for a very high resolution snapshot of that mugshot. And part of the long story of book publishing is we had to figure out if somebody was going to sue us for using the mugshots that were paid for by taxpayer dollars. And in the end, we ran it. The middle bottom pane of this is the moral majority mailer that went out to their members in 1983, setting the tone for establishing that AIDS was recognition of queer people's deviance, that it was a punishment from God, and that real families had to protect themselves against us. All of these things start to swim around me, and they all lead into different avenues. The Advocate article, the original copy that Michael's nephew has, we peeled back from its page that was pasted on, and he has handwritten notes disputing some of the details that were reported. Randy Schultz Archives has outtakes basically from And the Band Played On that I don't think have ever been published. Michael's mugshot led me to develop a relationship with the archivist at Vanderbilt University, where I can always just give him a call and say, James, help me out. The photography ends up being another whole side quest, getting permissions to use it. I'm essentially an information manager. Once I decide what has to be included, I have to make sure that it's correct, that no one's going to sue me for it, and that I have the rights to publish it in the length and in the way that I choose. My publisher is Norton. They're very particular about not editing images in any way. So if it is faded, if it's cropped badly, if it's cut from a frame, that's how it will show up in the book. So I'll give you some examples of what I had to do on this quest to find out more about Michael's life. This is a picture of his family. He was about 2 years old, so this places it at about 1956-ish. So his dad, Billy Dale, is in the background. His sisters, Alice, there's Michael, then there's his sister Susan, and Patrick on the far right. His father built that raft out of spare lumber and some inner tube tires. They would strap it to the wagon of their, strap it to the roof of their station wagon and drive out to Miami Beach. And that was their weekend. His dad was a firefighter, and they would spend hours on weekends with his firefighter buddies. I know how that goes because my dad was a firefighter, and they all hang together, they're a clique. I learned so much just from talking to Michael's surviving family members, and primarily that's his sister, Susan. The other brothers and sisters had died, and Michael's mother also died not too long ago, which really made me rue the fact that I only started researching this 4 years ago. Michael's mother only passed in 2008, so I was living here and I just hadn't thought about it yet. There's this critical need to talk to people as soon as you have the idea. Talk to them while you can, get them on the record, mic them well, and make sure that that file goes to an archive so that it can be preserved. Michael's mother did speak with a man named William Eskridge, a very important constitutional rights advocate and attorney who wrote a book about sodomy law, and he can't find the audio tape. So the things we lose along the way. Michael also has a nephew who is a professor of history at Bard and teaches gender and sexuality, and spent many weekends with Michael in the last 3 years of his life as he was coming out, as he was putting together his adult life. He has a niece, Simone, who is one of the most accomplished defenders of transgender people's rights in the state of Florida, has argued it for the state Supreme Court, and she was born the day that Advocate article came out. There's one picture of Michael holding her. He was still able to hold her a year before his death. Michael has a brother-in-law who, I'll redact the details, but they had some interesting adventures together. And they were friends. They became friends right away when they met. And he also has a cousin, Debbie, who lives in Central Florida, who I made contact with, and she had all the family's archival pictures from the 1800s. So the family's history went back to Cuba, where the grandparents had started up a pineapple liqueur factory and then moved it to Miami and then lost everything in the Depression and the Miami real estate recession in the late 20s. They're a great source of all this, but people's memories fail. So Ancestry.com has become a real go-to, and enough people have contributed in the time before we got very concerned with privacy rights. So I was able to find stepfathers and cousins and birth dates and verifiable documents to establish, yes, Michael was born on February the 13th, 1954, died June 13th, 1981. Family photos like these give me details too. You do have to get permission from family members even, and you have to get permission from the original photographer to use these. So a lot, like you can't use people's high school pictures because the school photographer can't, they're probably not around. Those companies don't like to give permission for their work to be used in nonfiction anyway. In this case, Michael's mother had taken the picture, and Susan, her living daughter, has all the rights and has all those pictures and brought boxes out of bookcases and just put them on the kitchen table, and we spent an entire day going through her family history. By the time I got through with all this, both Simone and Susan said, "God, you know more about our family now than we do." I don't. It's just I put it together in chronological order and reminded them of things. So you have to look in other places for this kind of information too. Michael had an art portfolio. After the decision in the Supreme Court case, he moved back to Florida and became an interior. He called himself an optical alchemist. He would take a space like this and design it to become this it would transmogrify to some drug-induced vision that he had at some point, and electric lizards and 3-foot-tall cockroaches, a giant 8-foot chicken wire hand painted neon green hanging over a bar. He had these visions and he would translate them into bar interiors, and he decorated some of the most popular bars in South Florida as long as he could. City directories, phone books, which, remember when you could look up somebody's address and just, all right, oh, that's where they live and that's their phone number and just call them? It doesn't happen anymore, but as long as we could, through basically the 1980s, those directories and phone books exist. The city of Miami's are kind of spotty, but there's a copy of every one of them in Tallahassee. And there was a very nice archivist who spent some time to look up some addresses for me, since I couldn't get there. I hope you're getting the relationship factor of this. I'm not an outgoing person normally, but this is, when I start working with an archivist, I'm like, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm trying to find, what do you know, how, can you help me out on this? I speak that language. Newspaper, too. Not just archival newspapers, but I happen to have many colleagues who worked at the Orlando Sentinel, the Fort Lauderdale Sentinel, the Miami Herald, all of which dumped their photo archives, and there's no real reconstructible record of where the pictures or the negatives are. But the photographers who took the pictures don't know. So just talking with them and figuring out where they might exist and what newspaper stories I should be looking for. There are like 6 reporters who did fantastic stories on this through the years, helped me track facts and data about his life. Because what I wanted to do was add upon the legal history of the case. There are dozens of law journal articles and précis and books that have big sections about the court and about how they dealt with the case and how it was argued, but virtually nothing about Michael's life. And I want people to understand here's the commitment that goes into being a Supreme Court test case, but also what kind of person is willing to do that and what the consequences are. So this is an interesting one. Michael had this relationship that involved Bill Hoven, who was a South Florida developer. His boyfriend, Cliff Pomeroy, who they couldn't get married or have any legal relationship, so Bill adopted Cliff. Cliff met Michael. They started a relationship. They went up to Gatlinburg to buy a piece of land where they were planning on living one day. And I don't know if that included Bill or not. Michael had an ex-boyfriend that followed them up there. It was all very fluid, and I don't feel the need to define it for them, but I had to figure out, sort of charted out, who do I talk to who might still be around? Talk to all these people. So it's really this montage of data. I talked to Michael's sister and her husband. I went to Nashville to video archives, but there are also copies of Gatlinburg newspapers and directories and phone books where I found the health food store that Michael started up with Cliff's money, which might have been Bill's money. Pegasus Cafe. His sister remembers helping him make tofu scrambles and tuck it into pita bread. And she and her husband both remember Michael and his friends just smoking cigarettes just constantly. Like, why would anybody go into a health store where they're just smoking nonstop? But it's just what those guys were doing. I had to make a specific trip to Gatlinburg to put a lot of that together. And I was able to do something I really hadn't planned on. I just knew that Michael had ended up there, and his sister mentioned he had bought some land. She didn't know what happened to it. So I went to the county land records office, started flipping through. All right, here's the register. There's Hardwick et al. Let me pull up the title. Oh, there's a name with it, Cliff Hoven. Okay. Took it home. A couple months later, we're sitting in the kitchen. Jack is making dinner, and I'm holding up pictures. I'm like, do you know who this is, Cliff Hoven? Somebody? What did you say? Yeah, he ran my office for 2 years. Ended up, after this period in the 90s, he came up to Atlanta and ended up working for my husband. Just one of those coincidences that checks me along the way and says, yeah, keep going. But also kind of led me to poke around online, and I found Cliff's brother on Instagram and connected with him. And he doesn't have a lot of memories of that time. His brother had some substance abuse problems, but he remembers Michael, even just for a brief weekend that he spent out there with them. Another set of details I had to find out. 811 Ponce de Leon Place. If you drive down that street right now, you'll see a blue house that has a large second story added to it, and the door has been repositioned. It was heavily modified in the 2010s and sold. It was sold first, and then the new owners bumped up and moved the entrance from the side to the front. And for a while, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but there was this bootleg comedy show going on in a backyard in Ponce Highlands. The guy would literally just charge people $20 a head, come sit in my backyard and we'll do a comedy show. That was the house. And I had seen 1 or 2 pictures of how it looked originally because it was in news stories from the day. But I wanted to know about the layout, so I went up one day and knocked on the door. Nobody was there. I could never make contact with the owner who was leasing to the comedy show guy. So through many, many text messages and phone calls with friends, I was able to connect with a very close friend of Michael's from that time who has had some unfortunate incidents with people following her, so did not want to talk at first, wanted to know how I found her, made contact through friends. Okay, now tell me about the house. She's like, oh, well, I used to do real estate. I can pull up the MLS, and here's all the pictures of the house and the floor plan as it existed when he lived there. And I can verify that's the butler's pantry, that's the kitchen, that was Michael's bedroom. She had slept in the bed because Michael would go off to work and leave his friends there to play Uno and smoke pot and, sleep in my bed if you need to. She described the home exactly and then sent me these pictures, and ironically at the time, Michael's room was the nursery. So she said, ignore that. All this is period correct. So I was able to map out the police report, how the officer approached the house, where he would have seen the guest sleeping on the brown couch in the living room, how he would have moved down the hallway while the guest went to the kitchen. And one of the biggest lessons of this is just the physical aspects of the story. And I'm lucky that I lived here and was able to walk down the street and see where the house is. I knew where the cove was. If you don't see the place, it's so much harder to reconstruct what might have actually happened in that time, that 30-second span where the policeman entered and made his way down the hall. And it gets worse because the city of Atlanta is terrible about keeping records in a lot of ways. They don't even have a track record of all the prisons, jails, and detention facilities that is reliable. There are some of these photos. I ended up having to go to this story written by King Williams on his Substack about following the history of Atlanta jails. I needed to know exactly where Michael was taken the night that he was arrested, and the descriptions that I read in his accounts, I needed to match those up with the building. Because somebody had told me at one point that the jail was located where the GSU library is, and it actually wasn't at the time. What you see here in the middle is this old jail that Atlanta had built in the 1890s, and they outgrew it. It was where the parking deck for Grady sits now. In a couple of accounts of Michael's arrest, he describes this Art Deco style building, like, well, that's kind of like Romanesque prison facility. How do you get there? I ended up looking in the Atlanta journals from the 1930s to find this story on the left about how they were going to reskin this building. And you can even see, if you line up some of the window placements, and they took off the tower, they added a wing onto the back, but they kept the same basic building, and that building was the Atlanta jail until 1982. So almost 100 years. And at the time, it was described as squalid. Atlanta had just built a new jail where they were going to move people to, but there was a year period where they could not afford or get the final okays from the city government to get prisoners actually over there. So they were in this facility that was holding 3 times the number of people it was supposed to hold. And that was not even the current Atlanta jail, which is, a constant source of human rights violations. It's a running theme, and maybe that's part of the reason Atlanta doesn't want to document it that well. But I had to find out which one it was. It turns out it's this building illustrated on the left, that version of it, down by Grady, not near Georgia State, but important in that he's in a building that dates back to the 1890s and the facilities that it had in it. They had a payphone that was close enough to make phone calls from. The guy who was arrested with Michael had a pocket full of quarters because he was playing pinball at the Cove that night. They were able to make phone calls and get bailed out, but I wanted to see the building so that I could talk about the building. And this was the really unexpected piece of information that I found. I was reading a journal article about the case, and the law professor Ann Goldstein mentioned in a footnote that said the ACLU asked Michael to make a statement in the moments after his arrest, in the days after, sorry. And he did it on a legal pad, handwritten. And there was no existing documentation of that anywhere in Fulton County records, municipal court records, nothing. It's probably sitting in a box somewhere off the Hollowell Parkway, but nobody knows where. So I emailed Ann Goldstein, who was on COVID leave and had some health problems and could not go back to her office for 2 years. So 2 years later, like clockwork, a task reminded me, email Ann Goldstein. Emailed her again. She's like, I finally made it. I have those papers, and they're in the mail on the way to you. So I have this copy of Michael's handwritten statement, in which you can see his handwriting getting larger and angrier and tilting more as he goes along, pages 4 and 5. Just, the text is just ballooning off of the page. And it tells you in his words what he perceived was going on, and it also clears up details that were in conflict from some of the arrest documents and also from profiles that were written about him. And it gave me the name of a person who was a friend of the roommate. I could never track the person down. There's a chance that he was one of the people that Michael knew that lost to AIDS. But there were details in there that would be nowhere else, and I had to have them. Municipal court records were non-existent. I asked Lawrence Tribe 3 or 4 times over the course of a year and a half to interview him, and finally got through to him at a time when he could do it. He spent a lot of time working on the 2020 election and had a little bit of a breather, and finally pulled his head up and said, I have all that stuff. It's at the Harvard Law Library. My assistant will get you copies of it. I also have the municipal court records. These are the only existing copy. So I have a complete paper trail for this case. He also had this fascinating document. It's this cardboard sheet. He would take 5 different colors of pens and scribble. It's like a tag cloud, if you remember that from that version of the internet, where just words surfacing, different colors, lines drawn to other things, a map of how his brain works. And he would do that for a Supreme Court case and take it with him to the lectern, one sheet of information, and he would put it down. And he said I would look at it, and I would look up at the justices, and I wouldn't look at it again. He would lock eyes with them and enter a discussion, and really believes that that's how cases have always been argued, at least his cases, where it's a one-on-one discussion, not angry, but a leveled, principled talk about what the law is and what it isn't. So he gave me access to all these archives, just really generously, and his assistant put it all together, and still in contact. I just mailed her a copy of the book like 3 weeks ago, so I'm hoping that she's got it and is reading it now. Again, a personal relationship that you have to kind of build up and get people's trust that you're doing something of consequence with this. The mugshots. All the places that didn't have them. I was watching a YouTube clip of gay history from the 1980s that NBC put together, and this flashed. And then there's also a side view. And, all right, it exists. Where can I get this? I got to go back to Nashville. So I found the clip again, and then got into this discussion with with Norton, my publisher, Amy Cherry, my editor, and Norton subcontracts out its legal reads. So eventually we got it kicked up to Norton's legal plus the lawyer who read my book for libel concerns. Everybody said, this is fair use. This is a government record paid for, and Vanderbilt is not claiming any copyright on the material. They can't transmit it outside of their walls as video. That's their agreement in acquiring it. But my friend sent me a note that said, this is a high-resolution version of the image that I think you're asking about. If this is confirmation you need of this being the correct image, no need to answer. Just left every other question on the table. So sometimes it's what's not said. Go ahead, use it. Go ahead. It's another copy of that. I can't talk about the case without mentioning Dwight Sawyer, the other man who was arrested that night. Dwight had a partner named Joey who had come up to look for an apartment, couldn't find one. Dwight came back, met Michael, befriended him over the course of a few days. They ended up back at Michael's place. Dwight ended up pleading out on the sodomy charge and ended up getting the marijuana charge dismissed because it wasn't in his hands. And Dwight ended up dying of AIDS in DC in 1996 after working for FEMA for a while. They had lived here in Atlanta for years after the case, and he didn't actually see Michael again after early 1983 because Michael returned to Florida in late 84, early 85, while the case was still in motion. Very quietly returned to Florida. The Supreme Court deliberates the cases that are brought to them. Real quick, the case that was filed in 1983 in district court was immediately decided against Judge Hall said there's already been a decision in the 70s that governs sodomy law. He has no case here, you're done. The appeal goes to the 11th Circuit, and in January of 1985, the 11th Circuit decides that Michael's rights of privacy were violated, and they publish that result in May. That case gets appealed by the Attorney General, Michael Bowers, which, because it's an appeal, it's Bowers versus Hardwick and not Hardwick versus Bowers. That's the case that gets shipped to the Supreme Court in November for consideration, gets certified, gets granted certiorari, and is argued on March 31, 1986, and decided June 30th, 1986. There are all kinds of notes that go on behind closed doors between justices, between the clerks for the justices and the justices themselves. There's a conference that's held, sometimes more than one, as they try to decide how they're going to vote. At the first conference, Michael won 5-4. In the days that followed that, Chief Justice Berger appealed to Justice Lewis Powell to change his vote. And he said, gay people, it's pathology. They're like prostitutes, they're like drug users. He had a psychology degree, and he was insisting that Michael and other gay people were morally and biologically defective in some way. And Powell was not firm in his belief in the case. He thought maybe it's a cruel and unusual punishment issue, but he wasn't willing to put himself at the center of the very first case that directly contemplated, sex. The part of being queer that people don't want to talk about in such a public way. And oddly, during the arguments of the case, Powell was very forthright in asking questions like, do you mean by the home, do you mean the privacy of a car? Can the home be a hotel room? What if they had been out in a public park? All these very specific questions. And then he asked his clerks while they were mulling the decision, how do gay men get erections? How do they keep them? And like very basic questions. He may or may not have known that many of his clerks had been gay. And one of the clerks during that term was gay, and he had met his partner, who his clerk had introduced as his friend, Chris, from New Orleans. There was some talk among Hardwick's legal team that they should bring it up to that clerk and say, look, you're the only one between us and a losing or winning decision. And the legal team decided that that was a step too far. So when I'm trying to unearth what happened in that process, luckily there's some fantastic materials because so many lawyers wanted to have an opinion on this case. The best one, Deb Price and Joyce Murdoch wrote this book about cases that involved queer people over history. And the Hardwick one is, the best version of the legal arguments, about 40 pages. And they talked to clerks, they befriended them all. They got the gay clerk on the record in multiple different ways, and other clerks too. And Pamela Carlin, who, didn't say it at the time, but now she says she's bisexual, and just all kinds of different opinions to overlay. What's missing are the opinions of the conservative clerks who worked for the conservative justices and the justices themselves. In most cases, their archives are still silent about the case. So I emailed one of them, Andy Schultz, who was Byron White's clerk during that term. Byron White wrote the majority opinion. He said, nothing exists anymore. White always believed that the decision said what he wanted to say, and good luck. I'm curious to see what you find. Well, he wasn't telling me the whole truth, because if you go to Library of Congress, Byron White's archives are there, and there are files. There's a file about the case they considered right before that. And to sort of set the mindset, Byron White was never going to vote for In Michael's Way, but he was actively considering in such a picayune way how they should spell marijuana in decisions. Like the whole world, we know it's with a J. He's like, it's the 1920s, we're spelling it with an H, should we change? His version of what we should be learning from these cases was hopelessly locked into a version of America that no longer existed. So there was no chance he was going to vote for Michael. And when word spread the decision was out on Michael's legal team, Abby Rubenfeld, one of the attorneys for Lambda Legal, called up and they said, yeah, it's a 5-4 decision, and Byron White wrote it. She's like, you're kidding me. Just went back to her typewriter and started to cry. So one of my rules of thumb is never accept no comment. It's not the final word. Go to the next 3 or 4 people who know them. So I talked to Thurgood Marshall's clerk after this, and he's like, "Oh, Andy? Yeah, he wasn't going to tell you anything." Marshall's clerk is Danny Richmond, who is a Columbia Law professor, Ed, and just a really charming person, and has spent a lot of time talking about his archives. He wrote this stinging memo in capital letters that said, "Why are we even talking about this? Everybody does this act. This is not just a gay thing." And Thurgood Marshall, when he died, released his archives within a year. Danny Richmond never expected his memos were going to get public play so soon after, if ever. So now he is forever known, gratefully, as the salty memo author, who is just very blunt about it. Sorry, I'm forgetting, Pamela Carlin was the clerk for Harry Blackman, who wrote the dissent in the case. She was Department of Justice for a long time, Civil Rights Division. She was, at one point, among the names mooted for a Supreme Court seat. Her language in talking about the case is a lot more measured. Here's the theory we were working from. It's pretty clear that this is how Blackman felt, so I drafted some of it. He refined that. Danny Richmond was like, "Marshall's a yeah, so what am I going to do?" They're really interesting to see the people that justices would choose as their clerks. And Marshall, in particular, was known as being really convivial and chatty and could trade jokes and barbs with his clerks. It was a very informal relationship. So he was apparently a great one to work with. Elena Kagan was his clerk in the next term. So here's just some other things that I found that still fascinate me. This note right here was Thurgood Marshall on the day the case was decided to Harry Blackman. Just sent a note by messenger that said, "He was great. There's nothing they could do, but you did your job." Some addresses where Michael lived, thanks to the Florida State Archives and the Miami District directories. In the middle, Florida has good sunshine laws that are being diminished now, but I was able to find this lien that the hospital in Miami that treated AIDS patients had placed against Michael in May of 1987. He couldn't pay any of his healthcare bills, and this, I think, was his first hospitalization. Fairly serious. Happened 3 weeks after he had gone to CUNY Law to be an honored guest to march with the law students and to stand on the dais while they got their degrees. And on the right is a restaurant where Michael worked. Happened to be next door to a very popular bathhouse in Miami at the time. And there's this whole cluster of gay-friendly businesses on that street, and Michael lived within walking distance. Couldn't afford a car. He had a very small apartment. He had a dog by that time that lived with him until the end. He just wanted a very quiet life after the case was over. I'm going to go through this more quickly because I'm taking so much of your time this evening, but the March on Washington was inspired by Michael's case, which politicized the HIV epidemic. It gave people a focus for their anger and their energy that they could direct back at the government that they thought wasn't acting quickly enough. It was multiple days, 500,000 people. How do you capture that in a few pages? I decided the Supreme Court protest was the cap of this. This is, people decided on the Tuesday after the protest march over the weekend that they would protest in some way at the Supreme Court. And the leaders of the protest first decided that they would go to the building and line up. You can line up to get into the Supreme Court to hear a case argued. And if you're early enough, take all the seats. And they thought there are little eyelets screwed into the pews where the public can sit. So we'll handcuff ourselves to those and then stand up during the case and hold protest signs or whatever they could smuggle in there. The court marshal had figured out that was going on, so he shut down the building, so that was not going to work. I still wanted to know that detail, so in April of 23, we went and lined up at 4 in the morning to hear Coogan v. Garland. And it was 40 degrees outside, and we couldn't get in until 9 in the morning. We were so cold. We were so cold. The case was the day that Clarence Thomas's first financial improprieties came to light. He was very silent after one question. You've never seen somebody so irritated at having to show up for their job as Sam Alito. Just acting in frustration the whole time. Left during the argument at one point, came back. You know, everybody needs a potty break, I guess. I wanted to recreate some of this, and this great picture of Michael arrested at the Supreme Court building, could not use it in the book because we could not assert who the photographer is, but here he is literally kneeling at the statue of the contemplation of justice. I go look for these details and know that they exist, and even if I can't republish them, they're still useful because I can see. I'm a DC native also, so been to the building dozens of times in other circumstances. I never knew the statues had names. Now I do. But I still couldn't find a lot of things. And I write in the book that there are so many more things I wish I could tell you about Michael's life. I couldn't find these two women that he said had brought him to Atlanta in the first place, some of his friends from Miami, anybody who knew him in college in Gainesville. He went to Santa Fe College, but took some classes at University of Florida. Wasn't able to make that happen. So much died with him, and really so much of history just ends up dying along the way. People throw away mementos, don't write things down as they're happening, and bury our trauma. And most people, it never resurfaces in a way that other people can understand. So it's difficult to document a life like his, especially when so many people died of HIV. Michael said when he was returning to his sister's house in the last 3 months of his life, on the car ride from Miami to Gainesville, he had lost 18 friends in the span of 5 years. There was hardly anyone left. So I tell people that. I feel like writing is an act of disclosure and trust. I want readers to trust me and know that I know the questions I cannot answer. I think that actually improves the way that people respond to history. The most powerful answer is, I don't know, but let's go find out. Let's go see if there's any evidence. The beauty of history is this lace work, and that the lace work depends on the absences. And Larry Tribe, funny enough, I started writing those notes, and 6 months later I talked to him, and he says, I always thought the beauty of the Constitution is what it doesn't say, and the silences, as well as the things that it affirms. So I write in the book that history is this kind of karmic recovery operation. We're trying to resurrect people and events and times, and while we're doing it, we're triggering new questions. We're casting new shadows and uncovering new stories that we don't have the time or the ability to tell in the moment. But the point of history is to provoke us into contemplation or into action, to learn what is presented to us as fact, and then often to seek to disrupt that perception of the truth. It's a radical pursuit of instability in the hope of achieving perfection, knowing that we'll always fail. We like running into brick walls. And there are times where I felt like I went too far in doing so. Did I need to show this picture of Michael 2 months before he died? In the book, I write that so many people went home from the March on Washington that his case had inspired, and they were inspired. They would found all these activist groups, but so many of those people would go back to their dreary and dangerous otherhood in lives in hometowns where precious little had changed. Many would go home to die. He was one. I think I decided that if I want this to be the best version of his life that we can retell, I have to confront this truth, and the best way to confront and translate it for people is to show them that this is the consequence of the failures of the way we believe in the law and the way we express it and the way that we support democracy. We end up with situations like Michael's where medicine isn't available, research comes too late, community has to step in where governments won't, and in the end, he was just surrounded by family that had to sustain him. And he said to his sister, so many of my friends can't go back home because no one will have them. At least I have you all. So as a reporter, as a historian, I'm trying to accumulate truth to put this story into place to tell something that's verifiable but also legible. Like you can understand it at some level without having to become an expert in it. Like I sort of believe I am. And you have to do it with empathy and accuracy. And often that means telling painful and awkward truths about people in the hope that other people will recognize themselves in those stories and understand more about their lives. If the story is worth telling, I tell my students, it's worth chasing down the smallest of details, asking awkward questions and sending random messages over Instagram and querying people who are going to ask you at some point, how the hell did you find us? I just got that question like 2 weeks ago from my people from my next book. How did you find us? Right? I always come away from my stories changed, and usually for the better, even though it takes forever sometimes to piece together these little fragments and to put them in the order that makes this what I hope is a beautiful mosaic. One of my students from last fall semester said it the best way possible. I keep this with me now. She's a Russian woman who came to the U.S. during the Yeltsin era and has lost most of her family since then. And she wrote in her final essay, "We're all shaped by the stories we inherit, even when they come to us in fragments." So.